This is Maureen from the DIY website madebymarzipan.com. Today I'd like to introduce you to the art of modern calligraphy. Unlike traditional calligraphy, which has many rules and can take years to master, modern calligraphy is about finding your own style and creating something fun and free-spirited. Let's start by talking about tools. First, you'll need a nib. Popular brands include Browse, Mitchell, and Speedball, among others. Some nibs have reservoirs, which are flat plates attached to the nib that hold extra ink when dipped. Sometimes these reservoirs are adjustable or removable. Others, particularly pointed nibs, have no reservoir at all. For beginners, I recommend Speedball's C-Class Calligraphy set, which costs around $10 and are available at many craft stores. Brand new nibs have a protective coating on them that needs to be removed, as it repels ink. There are several methods for doing this, with the most common being to quickly wave a flame by the nib to burn off the coating. Please remember, only an adult should use a lighter. Alternately, you can wipe it with acetone. Slide the nib onto the dip pen. When you insert a nib, try not to touch the point of the nib with your fingers, as this can leave oil on the nib. If you choose to buy a different dip pen, yours may have a metal insert instead. A common mistake is trying to insert the nib into the center of the hole. This will leave the nib extremely loose. The nib should actually be inserted along the interior side of the pen, wedged between the metal and the wood. Some calligraphers prefer an oblique pen, which has an appendage for the nib. This can help you maintain a consistent angle when writing. However, I think a straight dip pen feels more natural for beginners. Dip pens can cost anywhere from a couple dollars to a few hundred. Serious calligraphers may decide to order a handmade dip pen customized to their preferences. This pen was made by Jason from feralwoods.com and features a fat barrel that I find more comfortable. However, my Speedball holder will work just fine for today. There are many varieties of ink, including Winsor & Newton, Dr. P.H. Martin's, Higgins, and Speedball. I strongly prefer inks that are labeled India ink, rather than the more watery inks labeled with drawing ink or calligraphy ink. Alternately, you can experiment with acrylics or watercolors, although these can be harder to control. I recommend trying Speedball's Super Black India ink, which is available at most craft stores. There are a few other optional tools you may want to consider. You may wish to buy nib cleaner. However, if you're dedicated to cleaning your nibs immediately after use with water and then drying with a cotton rag, you shouldn't need it. You can dip straight from the bottle, but it can be hard to judge how far you need to dip, which can cause extra messes. I like to pour my ink into a dappen dish, which is a tiny jar most often used for manicures. You can purchase one for a couple of dollars from a beauty supply store. It's just the right depth for dipping your nib. Alternately, some beginners like to use a paintbrush to drop the ink right onto the reservoir. Finally, it's helpful to have some sort of pen rest. I picked this little dish up at a home goods store for a few dollars. The paper you choose will make an immense difference to the appearance of your calligraphy. Notebook or printer paper will cause the nib to snag, and small fibers will get caught in the nib. I really like Strathmore's line of writing papers. They have lined and blank pads. The paper is just thick enough to keep the ink from bleeding through, and I had zero issues with ink feathering. Alternately, you can use Strathmore's Bristol paper, which is a heavier weight and ultra smooth. Some calligraphers prefer a sloped writing surface. A binder works well for this. However, I prefer to work on a flat surface, cushioned slightly by either a cutting mat or the paper pad. Let's take a closer look at how the nib works. Place the uninked tip of the nib against the paper, then apply pressure while drawing downward. With the C3 and C4 nib, you can see 3 separate tines. As you release the pressure, the gaps between the tines narrow and then close. This creates the variations in stroke width that are the hallmark of calligraphy. Prepare your workspace with your paper, ink, and a piece of scratch paper. Use the same type of paper for both your project and scratch paper. You don't want to get fibers in your nib from cheap scratch paper. Dip your pen in the ink. You'll want to cover the nib about halfway, filling the reservoir. Wipe the excess ink on the side of the jar. Make a couple of test lines on the scratch paper to make sure the ink is flowing smoothly and isn't puddling. we're going to do a few drills. Draw a series of vertical lines on your paper. You'll want to hold the nib to your paper somewhere between a 30 and 45-degree angle. Perhaps the easiest way to visualize this is to imagine the handle of your pen as the hour hand on a clock. You'll want your holder to align at approximately 4 o'clock. You can play around with the angle to achieve different results, but you'll want to keep it consistent throughout your writing. Practice making the lines straight and of a consistent width. Get a feel for how much writing you can do before you need to re-ink. Now try crossing the lines horizontally to make a row of T's. Don't apply any pressure when writing horizontally. Aim for a thin, straight stroke. Next, try some curved lines. Whenever you're pulling the pen downward, apply pressure to thicken the line. Finally, practice circles. Draw these in two parts, starting the stroke at the center top and meeting in the center bottom. Again, remember to apply pressure when pulling downward and release as you reach the end of the stroke. There are endless variations of lettering styles in modern calligraphy, and of course you can experiment and create your own. However, I've created this printable guide for my Dahlia alphabet if you'd like a good place to start. There are more free calligraphy guides on my website, madebymarzipan.com, if you're interested. Start by lightly tracing the letters with an uninked pen to familiarize yourself with the strokes. Remember to test your inked pen on scratch paper. Right now I'm using Strathmore's lined writing paper. When spacing rows of letters, allow a total of 4 lines per row of text. The body of capital letters will take up 2 lines, with descenders extending down into the 4th line. Remember that you are trying to keep the nib's angle consistent. This means that there should be very little movement in your wrist as you write. Keep the pen moving as you write. Pausing mid-stroke can cause the ink to puddle, and hesitation will create wobbly lines. The body of the lowercase letters will sit on the second line, with ascenders extending upward to the first line and descenders going down 2 lines. Don't worry if it feels like you're making a lot of mistakes at first. It happens to everyone. Mistakes do happen, which is why I like to always start with an alphabet drill like this before working on an actual piece. Practicing calligraphy will help to establish muscle memory, and after a while, you'll be able to write without thinking too much about it. As you write, make an effort to keep your loops open. If you have too much ink on your nib, they can close, like on this U. Now try putting it all together to write words. With modern calligraphy, there's no need to try to keep your letters evenly sized or in a straight line. Pretty much anything goes, as long as it's aesthetically pleasing. If you need to re-ink mid-letter, overlap the stroke where you left off for a smoother line. I'm going to switch to the 512 pointed nib that's included with Speedball's calligraphy set. This nib is ideal for smaller, more delicate writing. Because it's narrower and only has 2 tines, you can achieve fine hairlines and your shades will be more obvious. Right now I'm using FW pearlescent acrylic ink. Acrylics dry more quickly on your nib, even during use, so you may need to stop and clean it. With these fine nibs, the ink has a tendency to pool when you make cross strokes, so you may wish to lift your pen when drawing a cross stroke and continue the line on the other side of the main stroke. Try modern calligraphy on envelopes, placeholders, wrapping paper, and wall hangings. It's very important to clean up immediately after you're finished. Unused ink can go back in the bottle. Wash the nib and dappen dish thoroughly under running water, then dry immediately with a cotton rag. If you're interested in traditional calligraphy, such as copperplate, you may wish to check out these resources for further study. If you'd like to learn how to draw flowers with your dip pen, I have a bonus video tutorial on madebymarzipan.com. I hope you enjoyed learning how to get started with modern calligraphy. Feel free to comment or ask questions, or visit my website, madebymarzipan.com, for more calligraphy tutorials.